Good evening. Hey, everybody. I'm Dr. Patrick Lewis, Director of Collections and Research at the Filson Historical Society. Thank you for joining us for tonight's lecture. Before we begin, we'd like to thank our event sponsor, the Louisville Coalition for the History of Enslavement, which is comprised of the following organizations: Farmington, Historic Locust Grove, the Oxmoor Farm Foundation, and Riverside, the Farnsley Mormon Landing. Thank you again for joining us both in person and virtually for Hidden in Plain Sight, Concealing Enslavement in American Visual Culture. Before I introduce our speaker, I'd like to remind those of us joining in person to please silence your cell phones for the duration of the program. It will be somebody. Don't let it be you. We'll have a short Q&A session at the conclusion of the program. We'll have mics up at either side of the room. If you're joining us virtually, please drop your questions in the chat and we'll share them as time permits. Our speaker tonight, Dr. Rachel Stevens, is Associate Professor of Art History at the University of Alabama. She's the author of Selling Andrew Jackson, Ralph E.W. Earl and the Politics of Portraiture. In preparing this project, Stevens served as a Tyson Scholar at the Crystal Bridges Museum of American Art in the fall of 2018, a fellow at Yale's Gilder Lehrman Center for the Study of Slavery, Resistance, and Abolition in the spring of 2019, and an Alyssa Mellon Bruce Visiting Senior Fellow at the Center for Advanced Study in the Visual Arts in the fall of 2020. Thank you for joining us tonight, and please join me in welcoming Dr. Rachel Stevens.
Thank you so much, Dr. Lewis. Thank you all, especially for making time on what I'm sure is a busy evening to be here. I'm so happy to and thankful to the Filson for hosting me and to all the organizers, especially Scott Scarborough. I started the research project here at the Filson back in 2017, believe it or not. And it's not a Kentucky story per se, but I knew there was a lot of really interesting and relevant things here. And they were nice enough to be the first archive to give me a fellowship to come and look at that stuff. And I'm so grateful. It really kicked off the entire project. And I'll tell you a little bit more about what I found as I go. But I want to quickly acknowledge the Filson staff who were so helpful to me back in 2017. Leanne Whites, Heather Potter, Jim Holmberg, and Jenny Cole, especially Jenny and Heather, who really worked shoulder to shoulder with me during that time to figure out what was here that might relate to my project. And I just came in with a vague idea that I'm really interested in thinking about the ways that enslaved people were pictured. And I have a feeling it has something to do with cover up, secrecy, concealment, something like that. And I'll dig into those ideas as we go, but they really help me think through what they might align visual culture wise and archive wise with those. And, the project developed from there. So I'm incredibly grateful. I'll just talk tonight for about 40 minutes. I'll try to end maybe 6:45 or so. I shouldn't have said a number out loud because that means I have to actually stop at that time. But I want to invite questions and comments afterward, especially for the Kentucky material, which I don't know as well as many of you in this room do. I would love to have a conversation about anything or discussion or questions or anything that might come to mind. So I'll try to save plenty of time for that. I also want to offer a brief warning that the information I'm going to discuss and illustrate is racist and violent and likely troubling. And I will completely understand if you want to close your eyes or walk out of the room for a bit or look away. On those notes, I'd also just like to publicly acknowledge my own identity as a white Southern woman and its relationship to the material. Really, it was right at the beginning of this research that I first began learning about the visual history of slavery. Attending predominantly white institutions, I hadn't really been taught about the history of enslavement. And once I started doing that, I had a lot of reflection on the idea that perhaps I was not the right person to be working on racist images that work to maintain slavery and that were created by white artists. So I considered the idea that perhaps keeping them hidden away and not publishing them would save some of the pain that they cause. But ultimately, I decided that in order to learn from the past, we have to learn about the past. I decided to learn about the images and to publish about them, not only because I do believe that we have to learn about the past in order to work towards a just future, but also in many cases, these are the only representations of particular enslaved people that exist, even if we don't know their names. If we read them against the grain of their intentions, we might be able to locate the humanity and the personhood of the people they picture. That certainly doesn't hold true for every image we're going to look at. Many of them are just anonymized images of enslaved people. But those images, whether they pictured particular people or not, um, were used by their enslavers to cover over, conceal, or erase the humanity of the people they pictured. So that undergirded the book, Concealing Enslavement, and the story that I'll now share with you. This is just the cover page for the book. And I just start here by saying that I'll kind of lay out what I'll do here. I'll discuss the origination of my research, and then I'll address some of the key takeaways or findings, illustrate many, many examples. And the examples that I'll show you are so rich that I could spend the entire time talking about one image. So I can unpack them more in Q&A if you'd like. But I use them to show you sort of the ways collectively to try to figure out the story of the ways that art history or visual culture was implicated in the debate over slavery. Particularly, how did art support slavery? How did it work in pro-slavery ways? And so that's what I'll try to unpack here for you. Ultimately, as I said before, all of it attempts to cover over the humanity of enslaved people. So in addition to trying to figure out that very terrible, ugly, and racist side of the story, I tried to balance it by figuring out who the people were when possible and by reading them back into the story. Oops. Oops. There we go. So my work first started when I stumbled upon this image. I had been studying images of Andrew Jackson for years at the point that I saw this, and I was nearly finished writing a book about portraits of Andrew Jackson when I saw this, and it sort of floored me. And I realized that I had never, oh shoot, I'm sorry. Okay, PC times. We will do it. Anyway, I realized that I had never seen a representation of the people he enslaved on his property. And even though I had for years been reading every bit of correspondence from Andrew Jackson that I could get my hands on, learning as much about him as I could, thinking in depth about his relationship with his personal artist, whose name was Ralph E.W. Earl, who he hired to paint him full time, I argue, because I think he needed the visual bolstering that an artist could provide. And all of that stuff I had read and learned, I had never seen mere mention of enslavement under Jackson. Now, there, of course, are plenty of those records, and that's not admittedly what I was going in to look for. And the scratching at the surface can reveal lists of names of families enslaved at the Hermitage and on and on and on, but it's buried in the record, and it certainly wasn't available in the visual record that I was studying. And so even though I considered myself a historian of Southern art and someone well-versed in the material, I had never even really encountered a study that specifically centered or pictured enslaved people or described how the images were used. And so that got me really kicked off on a project that got me wondering about just the stuff and trying to figure it out. And ultimately what I find, I'll share with you, but I found that the story it's unwieldy and it's enormous and kind of hard to wrap your mind around, but also hasn't ever really been systematically thought about. So I tried to do that. All that to say, the book's really big and heavy because there's a lot of information. There's a lot of material. And even with that, I felt like I was barely scratching the surface and couldn't dig in as deeply as I wanted to because I was trying to piece together these bigger themes. So I began to wonder in what other ways had slavery appeared in the visual record. What was the nature of that tradition, if any? How did enslaved people interact or respond to Euro-American work? And I set off from there. So before I dive into specifics, and I show you this as an illustration of one of many of the variety of ways that enslaved people were pictured in art. Um, I'll summarize here, just with this as an illustration, some of what I learned as a starting point. And this might sound incredibly obvious to you, because much of the visual strategies continued into the contemporary period. So much of it speaks to the power of imagery to persist over time. And something we are all probably painfully aware of is that change is very slow to come. So anyway, at the basic level, pro-slavery art was created in response to abolitionist art. It was a call and response situation. So you're probably all familiar with the basic nature of abolitionist images. I'll show you a couple if you're not, but they tried to get at the violent nature of slavery in order to expose the inhumanity of the institution. And that began in force by many women, mainly in the 1830s, as an organized sort of methodical use of visual culture to underscore their message, which is slavery needs to be abolished. It's horrific and violent and inhumanitarian. So these were very powerful. These messages were being spread in rough woodcuts and fine engravings and other printed material nationally. And pro-slavery people in the South felt they needed to respond because those images were so powerful. So that's what started the response to abolitionist imagery. And that's what sort of began to be a story of how we justify slavery. So they were attempting to justify it in the visual culture. I'll dig more into that in a minute, but another big theme or takeaway was that even though the abolitionist materials were organized and methodical, like I said, pro-slavery art was catch as catch can, piecemeal, disorganized. And I believe that's because ultimately slavery is not justifiable. It's not possible to do what they were doing. And so they were attempting to do anything they could to make it seem like it was a benevolent institution. The pro-slavery art also aligns in it aligns in really perfectly parallel ways with the pro-slavery rhetoric. Again, this might not be surprising, but the artists who were working for enslavers or people who supported slavery were illustrating what the rhetoricians were saying. So there are a number of themes that I'll describe and show you, but this is a very specific instance in which artwork aligns with political messaging and is intended to bolster the political debate. And that goes for both sides of the slavery debate. My big kind of overarching theme, however, is that in a variety of ways, most all of the pro-slavery art concealed enslavement in one form or another. And I'll show you that as we go along too. So just really quickly to give you a little primer on abolitionist art so we can see what the work I'll show you is responding to. This is, of course, the Wedgwood medallion, Am I Not a Slave and a Brother? Am I Not a Man and a Brother, excuse me. And it's an 18th century work, but this became sort of like a major icon of the abolitionist movement that was used again and again. And we see it appearing across the landscape of the visual art of slavery as a specifically abolitionist idea. There's problems with it, and we could dive into that. But this is what kicked it off. But it really wasn't until the 1830s when some of the key visual tropes of the anti-slavery movement really came into fruition. So this is a very large lithograph produced by the American Anti-Slavery Society. And this is a fine lithograph, but it represents many of the most typical tropes illustrated by abolitionists. And I'm not sure if you can see all of the details here. They are violent and horrific, but basically it represents violence, especially whipping, which was a very common theme in abolitionist art, enslaved people being sold at auction, and along with that, the separation of families. And those three really horrific affronts to the humanity of these people were illustrated again and again by abolitionists. So powerful were they that pro-slavery groups felt they needed to respond in a variety of ways. So the works created in support of slavery, of course, showed none of that violence. You will not see violence present within art of slavery that's produced from a pro-slavery perspective. Not surprising, but it just is one tiny example of the covering over of the truth that we see again and again in this story of concealment that I'm sharing. Art produced in support of slavery, like I said, was not strategic. It was not organized. And so I tried to work through it to figure out or to categorize the ways that pro-slavery artwork visualized or more commonly omitted enslaved people. This is a very early example of a work that's taken from the perspective of the enslaver, and it's from outside of Charleston, South Carolina, by a local artist there named Charles Fraser, and it dates to about 1800. But it represents what, by and large, was the most common way of representing the enslaved South by the white ruling class, and that was to omit the presence of slavery altogether. Especially before about 1830, before they really needed to represent the institution of slavery as what they called a positive good, or felt that they needed to do that, artwork could basically ignore what they admitted was, or what they called a necessary evil institution. So earlier artworks do regularly omit enslaved people, and this kind of dominated the visual record before 1830. Planters commissioned views of the properties that celebrated the land and the enslavers themselves, and we see the enslaved man and wife here, but ignored the people who cultivated it, even though, of course, balancing either side of this Georgian mansion are sites of work or habitation for the dozens of enslaved people who were actually present at this site. If you fast forward in time to the antebellum period or nearing the Civil War, enslaved people do commonly appear in similar scenes. But their numbers, it's still not a truthful image because their numbers were diminished. The scenes look benign and orderly and pleasant. You know, it's a romanticized view of the plantation that, of course, continues to be promulgated for generations. So in this case, buildings or sites of work like the cotton gin structure on the left or the screw press just beside it that was for baling the cotton are present here. And there are people of color present in the scene, but they are not engaged in hard labor. They are well dressed, and they look to almost be in like a mutually beneficial situation or mutually pleasant situation. So it's covering over other aspects of enslavement. This panoramic scene from 1860 represents Belmont Mansion, which is in Nashville, by a local artist named James Wagner. And it similarly aggrandizes the property, but only makes mere reference to the 32 enslaved people who lived here and took care of the home, and its white family who owned the entire scene. So likewise, one argument about slavery was that it was a natural role for people of African descent. And so I look at the African-American man emerging out of the greenery in the foreground here to think that maybe that references the idea of the natural inclination of these people for chattel slavery. The constant surveillance of enslaved people is also perhaps unwittingly referred to here, not only by the white men on horseback in the foreground, but perhaps by the 105-foot lookout tower that did exist on this ridiculous property in Nashville. The matron, Adelicia Ackland, was one of, if not the richest woman in the South, and she poured some of her money into her property, as you can see here. The man in the foreground, the African-American man, by the way, is perhaps James Ackland. Now, I haven't been showing you images where the enslaved people are identifiable yet, and he may not be based on any figure, but we can look at and think about the records of the enslaved people at Belmont, understand what their roles were, which there are good records for, and say that perhaps this may represent James Ackland, who was born enslaved under the matriarch Adelicia, and then who became a stable servant and lived long into emancipation or after emancipation. Another justification put forward was that enslaved people were naturally savage and or violent, which sort of goes against the idea that slavery was natural. So you'll see that all of these works are just self-contradictory over and over again, and it's enough to make your head spin. But again, they're trying to just throw whatever will stick at the slavery justification system, because I think it wasn't possible to justify it. So in response to abolitionist scenes of violence, here we see an image that illustrates the Nat Turner Rebellion that flips the script and shows the enslaved people as the violent offenders, even placing a young mother with her children in the pose of the supplicant slave in this case. I won't stay here too long, even though I could talk a long time about this very rare and early scene. But in this case, it puts the violence of enslavement in the hands of a white woman. But that's as a justification for the threat of sexual violence by the enslaved man, who's represented again in supplication here. He had come into her bedroom, and this was a story that made headlines on the eastern shore of Virginia. But showing the enslaved man in supplication perhaps was the most readily available image that people would have had to draw to base a view of an enslaved person on. But of course, this is not abolitionist in intent. It's intended to expose the naturally violent nature of the enslaved, at least as the argument went. Another argument posited that under slavery, the alleged savage African could be converted to a productive Christian. So the use of the Bible and of Christianity to justify slavery is, of course, an enormous story, and it was used in myriad ways. But there was artwork produced that supported those ways. So Christian justification, like I said, took many forms, but here enslavers and enslaved listen to a preacher together in what's called family worship. I'll get back to the family idea in a minute, because one of the most common ways and one of the most stereotypical ways that continued in the postbellum period was that enslaved people were happy. They were represented as happy again and again. This is only one print of many scenes I could show you. This is by a pro-slavery artist and printmaker named Edward Williams Clay. It's called America from 1841. And typically, when prints like this were made, and there are many, many of them that exist, it was the enslavers who were quoted in the word bubbles, so to speak. So in this case, the planter's here, and he says, "Nothing shall be spared to increase their comfort and happiness." So enslavers regularly cast themselves as benevolent and as caring so-called masters in order to show not only Christian duty and benevolence, but also that they cast themselves as responsible for the care and happiness of the people they enslaved. It sort of boils my blood just to think and talk about that. This is a specifically Kentucky image some of you may have seen before. It's in the Kentucky Historical Society. It's by a little-known artist named Charles Vaughan. Sunday Morning in the Kitchen. It dates to about 1840. Not much is known about the history of this work or the artist himself, and there are many layers here to unpack. One of them being the title, Sunday Morning in the Kitchen. And I don't know exactly what to make of it, except for that I know church is referenced in Sunday morning. And so this is a Christian family, perhaps not attending services or mass, but left together to play the phrase that we commonly see in correspondence, the family black and white, may also be represented in this image. Enslavers commonly referred to the people they enslaved as their family. We see this in correspondence again and again. I saw it in letter after letter here in the archives at the Filson, and many artworks served to represent slavery as a familial situation. Now, of course, we know nothing could be further than the truth. And so the artwork works overtime to represent slavery as a familial situation. This is a beautiful work. I sort of selfishly show it to you because it's just so hauntingly beautiful. And it's not very well known. It's located in the Historic New Orleans collection, but it's by a French silhouette artist named Edouard, who had been commissioned by a white family of enslavers from Natchez, the Young family. It's huge for a silhouette in the period where you commonly just saw inch-high silhouette bust portraits. But in this case, all of the members of the family or of this household are arranged in this room that's set up to look like an antebellum planter's parlor. But interestingly, enslaved people are included in it. I won't get as deep as I could into the fact that this is black paper representing these shadowy figures. But if we look at the specifics of the figures themselves, it, I believed, is intended to illustrate this idea of slavery being familial. You see the enslaver, Benjamin Farrar Young, tall, standing in the center, and right in front of him is Henrietta Young, a woman he enslaved. We know her name not because there are any records of enslavement in the Young family particularly, but because the French silhouette artist kept records of every single person whose silhouette he ever cut. So he lists all the names of the people that are included here, and he included the name Henrietta Young, who is the short woman in the center who's holding the baby out to its mother, and William Young, who I believe is the child on the farthest right, although it's hard to make a definitive determination of that. Again, putting them all in this same shadowy black paper maybe is meant to illustrate the idea that slavery in the Young household was like a family. This would have been hung on the walls of this parlor, and it would have been attempting to communicate that idea to visitors, I believe. Now, a significant subset of images of enslaved people exist in photographs like this. There could be a whole book about these images. They were made by the hundreds. I still don't know exactly why this particular composition became such a common trope, but photographs of enslaved women with the white babies of their enslavers were produced again and again and again. And there are so many layers to these images and they're so revealing. But to me, the most important idea is that they actually visualize the enslaved person. We always, or almost always, have the name recorded of the white child. It's much rarer to have the name recorded of the enslaved woman. And that is probably not surprising to you. Also, they're sometimes partially blocked from view. They're always seated in the background, sometimes in shadow. Exposure times were adjusted for the white skin. In this case, the woman in the back's right side of her face almost kind of disappears into blackness. Sometimes the clothing of the white sitters has been hand touched with paint. And so all of this speaks to the racial hierarchies of the period and tells us a lot about the actual nature of enslavement, perhaps. But like I said, I find such power in them in having a visual record of this specific enslaved person that we don't know her name and we don't have any other record. But the ways they look at the camera, the ways that we might read something into the scowls on their faces, I think helps demonstrate their agency and their humanity and gives us maybe just a teeny sense of their lives, even though we can't assume to know what was in their actual heart. So this is a typical example from Arkansas. We don't know much about its history. It's just been given the title at the Library of Congress, African-American woman holding a white child, and that's kind of typical. But in some cases, the sitters are identified. So this particular case drives the idea of the family even further. And that's what I believe was the intention here. Why were so many of these created? Perhaps it was because they were intended, like the Edouard silhouette, to communicate that idea, that false idea of the so-called family black and white. And in this case, you've got baby Bradford Harrison seated with the enslaved woman who took care of him, whose name's Ellen Sherwood, it literally encased in the same closed case with baby Bradford's parents, Jonathan and Carolina Harrison. So this, I think, I don't know, I just read this as very intentional in communication of that idea of the family, so-called black and white. Like the last one, we also know the identity of the people pictured here. This is Lucy Cottrell holding baby Charlotte. And I mentioned the scowls on their faces. And to me, you just can't mask the misery and anger of this woman. But this is also very special because we do know some about Lucy's history. And so there's wonderful work, of course, being done here at the Filson and across the South and really nationally to dig up these Black genealogies, which are so critical and not always directly available. And the photography, when you can align an identity with a photograph, that to me just brings such value. But Cottrell here was ultimately emancipated in Kentucky. I don't know where. I know it was in 1855. She was born at Thomas Jefferson's Monticello, and she was enslaved by Thomas Jefferson. And then at his death, when his property was dispersed, she was purchased by a professor named George Bladerman, an early professor at the University of Virginia. So she was actually probably one of the first inhabitants at one of the pavilions, the basement of one of the pavilions at the University of Virginia. Ultimately, after her enslaver passed away, she was brought to Kentucky by the wife of her enslaver who emancipated her. And this here, Charlotte, is the granddaughter of George Bladerman. Now, many of you are probably familiar with this work. I first saw it in 2017 when I was here digging the archives and trying to figure out what these so-called mammy and child images were all about. But one thing I did know is that that tradition, even though it was so prominent in the antebellum period, of course, it continued for generation after generation. And so this postbellum example shows you a very similar setup to all of those antebellum daguerreotypes that I was talking about. So it evolved over decades post-war. It became part of this so-called happy mammy stereotype, but the images themselves changed very little. So we're so lucky to have this image and to have incredible documentation about this woman, Louisiana Taylor. She holds the granddaughter of her former enslaver, Helen Stites. And I'm sure many of you are more familiar with the Oxmoor story than I am, but the record that exists, although it gives us really important clues to who she was and what her life was like here, it's all filtered through the words of her white enslaving, the family who enslaved her. And the woman, Louisiana Taylor, served as a nursemaid to the Bullitt children. We know that from correspondence in the Bullitt family papers. The Bullitt family, and of course, scores of others across the plantation South, as I've showed you, use photography for justification before slavery, justification for slavery before the war, and used it to romanticize slavery after the war. And this, I think, I would argue, is an example of that. Excuse me. Mildred had reported in 1842, and she's the matriarch at Oxmoor, that 2-year-old James, who was the youngest sibling of the family, quote, is fairly weaned from Beck as a nurse, but stumps his toe once in a while, which is mere matter of moonshine with the children, as you know. I had to throw in the moonshine comment because I thought it was funny in the midst of a not so funny situation. But she was talking about the fact that her youngest was being weaned from the nursemaid. Other records relate that Louisiana Taylor had been the nursemaid for many of the Bullitt children. An older Bullitt brother named John remembered, quote, excuse me, getting over a cold. The Negro women, especially the mammies who nursed or tended the children of the family, conceived of a greater affection for them than for their own children. Now, this statement is, of course, self-serving, and serving as a nurse for their enslavers' children meant necessarily neglecting their own children, especially if they were serving as a nursemaid. And so this was, again, another form of justification that merged into romanticization of the Old South. I'll show you a few examples of what I saw as vast destruction across the record. Again, because I believe that you couldn't justify it, what the people that supported slavery often turned to violence and destruction, and this extended to artworks. This is just a northern print that criticizes the southern burning of those abolitionist materials, which did in fact happen. And I should have warned you before I put the image of Peter's back here before you, but I'll jump off of it because it is so horrific and tell you the story of destruction of that particular image. Now, that was a very powerful image of abolitionist violence used to be distributed widely. It was for sale in abolitionist publications. It was distributed to Union soldiers to fight, to remind them for what they were fighting for. And it was encountered by a Southern man on a Northern rail car for sale. He thought that he found the only copy. He purchased it on the rail car and ceremoniously ripped it to shreds, thinking that he could destroy the evidence. That type of destruction by Southerners of the truth of slavery and images that represented slavery happened again and again. Here in this particular work, it's a image that celebrates and belittles the destruction of Abolitionist Hall. In 1838, only 3 days after being opened, Abolitionist Hall in Philadelphia, which was a site for a variety of conferences and discussions and speeches and activities and printing press for the abolitionist movement, was stormed by mob violence and torched and burned, and ultimately destroyed. An image like this, which doesn't still exist in its original form, which is why the image looks like this. It's a photograph of the original show, but belittles the interracial activities that were taking place under its doors and really celebrates the destruction of this particular site. The overarching theme of concealment also found specific examples in terms of artistic cover-up. I show you this image. Anytime you see an image of a slave auction, you can pretty much presume it is an abolitionist scene. Showing a slave auction refers to, of course, the literal sale of human people. And so Southerners were never going to expose this, even though slave auctions and slave trades could take place very publicly across the antebellum South. They took place in a variety of locations. So I show you this to show you a scene in which several similar images exist by abolitionist artists, this by an English visitor named Cranston, called Slave Auction Virginia. He came to Richmond specifically to see slave trades and to experience it, and then he went home and he produced this work. But supporters of slavery and enslavers were so wary of truthful demonstrations of slavery that people were not allowed to show up at a slave auction and start sketching. You would be viewed with immediate suspicion if you did that. In fact, another English artist, Eyre Crow, famously visited a Richmond slave auction and was literally picked up by his breeches and kicked out when he started sketching the scene. Never until I came to the Filson did I ever see, I presumed that photographing a slave auction was completely outlawed. And I think it was. But I saw here, or the archivist showed me here, the photograph on the left that purports to visualize a slave auction in Lexington, Kentucky. The records are very scant and sketchy, and I can't be 100% sure that that's what we're looking at, but there are a couple of different views. I show you them here, and I think they're taken almost like sequentially, that are labeled on the left, slave auction at Cheapside, which is the public square in Lexington, where auctions of enslaved people occurred for decades. And then the image on the right was labeled slave, there's a typo there, but a slave sale in Lexington at Cheapside. And that was in the Kentucky Historical Society. So it's kind of hard to see the details. The photographs are very grainy, but it almost looks to me on the left like there is an auctioneer right at center who's surrounded by men in hats, which could be potential purchasers. and enslaved people peppering the scene, perhaps being loaded into the cart and wagon, perhaps being sold off like the livestock that's around them. The scene on the right seems perhaps that maybe it's the before scene or maybe it's the aftermath, but there's a row of what appears to be African-American people seated and perhaps either awaiting their fate or seeing what happens if they were in fact sold south. A lot of correspondence describes the fear of enslaved people for being sold away from Kentucky, of course. Being sold to the Deep South was something that all Kentucky enslaved people feared. It meant so many things, not only hard labor, but probably being separated from your family, perhaps never seeing the people you knew again. And this photograph, while it doesn't perchance take an abolitionist or pro-slavery bent, we have to presume that it's exposing the truth of slavery, and that therefore it seems to have been taken almost from a building across the street, kind of without anybody really knowing, because I know that photography equipment would not have been allowed at this scene. I'll close with one last example of concealment, which is to me the most powerful example that I came across. And you may have seen this painting before. It made national headlines just within the last couple of months, but I can quickly relate the story because it illustrates to me how strongly people felt about covering over the truth of enslavement and the lengths to which they would go and the ways that artwork was implicated in it. So this is the painting that long existed since the 1970s at the New Orleans Museum of Art that was attributed to a Louisiana artist named Jacques Amon, and it was titled Portrait of Three Children. Now you can already see in this landscape view in the background the shadowy figure standing against the tree. So I have to believe that people sort of knew that there was something else going on with this. And I don't know the situation for sure, but it seems that the New Orleans Museum of Art probably didn't want to touch it with a 10-foot pole, and they deaccessioned it and sold it away. It ultimately, a couple years ago, made it into the hands of a collector named Jeremy Simeon, who had it cleaned and conserved. And voila, lo and behold, there's an image of an enslaved young man where none existed in the painting before. So he had been literally painted over and covered up. And conservation shows that that probably happened around 1900. So the painting was in the hands of the family for many generations. And at some point, they probably wanted to disassociate their family history from slavery, is what I would guess. But for whatever reason, the painting over of Belizaire, who was a person that was known in the family and who served the family for decades, kind of reveals some of the ugly and hidden truth of enslavement. So Jeremy Simeon, a collector of African American art in Louisiana, found it, knew about the hidden figure, found the painting, had it cleaned and conserved. Long story short, told the Metropolitan Museum of Art about it. They jumped at the opportunity to purchase it from him. They did. They put it in a period frame. And now today, Belizaire and the Fry Children, as they have titled it, is hanging in the American wing at the Metropolitan Museum. And when they did that, I almost shed a tear because I thought, not only is Belizaire's name getting recognized in a way that much of the art of enslavement isn't possible to do, but also this very lifelike representation of an enslaved person, which is also so rare, is on the walls of one of the most esteemed institutions. And so it just felt like this story is important, and I'm so glad other people are recognizing it too. With that, I think I will close, and I'm going to skip over a couple images I was going to show y'all just for the sake of time. But I would love to field comments or questions, and I can dive deeper into any of the ideas I've addressed here over the next few minutes. Thank you all so much.
Well, thank you so much, and please come to one of the mics on either side of the room if you do have a question. If you're watching virtually, put those questions in the chat, and I'll try and relay them as they come to me. To get us started, I wondered if you could talk a little bit about the book production process. As you say, that's a lot of images to manage, and one of the things that is the most difficult in any sort of publishing is rights management and all of those sorts of things. Talk about what it takes to produce a book where you can talk about and show these images.
How much time do we have? No, I'm kidding. I'll try to make a very long story short. But essentially, as you've sort of gathered over the last few minutes, I did want to tell this really big story. And I did feel the urgency of the need to illustrate the scenes, both big and in color, and to show a lot of images, because what I was trying to do is establish the patterns that I just barely touched on, and to establish the idea that, in a variety of ways, enslavement in the visual arts involves concealment. So there ultimately, I had a press, the University of Arkansas Press, who is doing a whole series on American art and race. So it fit perfectly with them. I met the editor. He really liked the project. He said, if you let me do it, I'll make it big and I'll make it in full color. And because he felt it was important too. And so I said, okay, yes, that would be amazing. And can I have 175 images? And he said, yes. And ultimately it's 164. But the process, after you've, pieced the whole story together and done all the research and spent all the years in the archives and tried to figure that stuff out, then I had to go to the repository of each image. I had to write to them and say, can I publish your image? And they would say, yes, that will be $176. And so I had to go through and figure out what the total cost was for those images, because although the production is covered, it's up to the author to pay for the rights of reproduction typically. And so then I had to write grants to raise those thousands of dollars for the images. And then I had to get the money and physically pay for the images. And then they send them to me in high resolution, and I just pass them on to the press. But you're right, as someone who's coming through a book publication now, to feel the deep levels of organization and tedium and administration that it requires even to put that together. But the way it looks, I have nothing to do with. I wrote all the words and I provided all the images, but the ways they're sized and the ways they're spread across the large format book was all the work of a very talented graphic designer at the University of Arkansas Press named Daniel Bartolotto, who did that. He read it word for word and tried to make the production tell the story. So I did the paperwork and I wrote the story, but he made it look pretty and he really made it sing. Thank you.
Well, and I really appreciated the title page that you showed there with the actual images sort of coming through in the letters. That tells the whole story.
Thanks. Yeah, he was amazing the way he interpreted it.
You touched on how the concealment of slavery considered even after emancipation. Do you go into how that same kind of concealment even continues today?
Yes and no. Actually, not really, because what I was, the story was already way too big. And you saw me at the end, I wanted to get to the part of the story where I said, the ways that enslaved people were caricatured and stereotyped and represented, in this particular case as loyal to their enslavers, was something that during the Lost Cause era looked the same. Those justification looked the same, but now they were used as apologist images, as lost cause images. So the lost cause imagery that many of us are well familiar with today didn't originate after the Civil War. It originated in slavery and just took on kind of different changed meanings after the Civil War. So the last chapter of the book is about the lost cause and the ways that specifically artists in Virginia drew on those works to continue concealing the identity of African Americans and to continue to work to subjugate and belittle them. In the conclusion, I hint at the idea that of the relevance of these ideas, and not the continued concealment, as you say, but the ways that contemporary artists, so many contemporary artists, are responding to and overturning this stuff. So I touch on that. I use an example by Fred Wilson and a couple of other artists, Carol Walker, and the list goes on and on and on. And that's a whole different book project. But you're right that I felt the deep relevance of this stuff, even though it was anywhere from the 1830s to 1860s. I was writing this during the era of the Trump presidency, and I just did feel painfully aware of how relevant it still is. And I gestured to it in the book, but didn't directly address it. Yes, ma'am.
The last slide. The last one. Okay. I mean, does he not look like them to you? I
Mhm.
mean, I mean, that's what's more powerful. And what does he have on? Would a slave be dressed that way?
That could be maybe like the finest form of livery that would exist for a domestic enslaved person in New Orleans, which Belisaire was. But I take all of your points and I totally agree. I also think we can't know exactly what Belisaire looked like. And perhaps Jacquemin, had a way of painting faces where they all sort of look the same. Now, I'm trying to play devil's advocate for what we all know was such a common situation and what might have led the enslaver to commission a work that included Belisaire because he was his own blood relation. We don't know that. I can't speak to that at all, but it's certainly a strong possibility. And it was so intuitive of you to come up with that. But yes, he's elevated in a way that enslaved people were not usually, especially in the visual arts.
Hi, Dr. Stevens.
Hello.
So when I'm viewing these images, some of them are intended for public consumption and some are for private consumption. So I'm thinking about how much of them are a reflection of a sort of personal convincing of themselves, of the role of enslaved people, and how much of it is a sort of proactive public attempt to change minds or alter the course of what was inevitably the end of slavery. So if you could speak to that.
Yeah, thank you so much for that question. The reception of these is really hard to get at, but also I think so important. So many of them, almost all of them, would have been seen in the context of the enslaver's home. Maybe for public consumption because the parlor of the enslaver for a certain class and a certain race, certain class, was kind of public. And so I do think they were intended to share these general messages that always seem to me across all my research to be enslavers trying to convince themselves of these things. And I couldn't get at the psychology of that. I didn't know how to talk about that or how to really process it or use like research in the archives to prove, but that's definitely what it seemed to me. This, like, we've got to talk about it this way and we've got to think about it this way, maybe in order to make ourselves feel okay, or maybe in order to, I don't know, continue or to stuff our pockets and keep our personal economy going. But you're right. That's what it seemed like, as much of a message for oneself as for others. But I had to focus on the way it was being projected to others because I couldn't get inside the head. At least I didn't know how to do that. If there are psychologists in the room that could help me, give me the verbiage or think about that, I don't know. That was a different project, but it's a really important thing to say. So thanks for bringing it up.
We've got a couple of questions that have come in from our virtual audience, and I'm going to kind of merge them together because they're actually having a conversation in the chat as we're going.
Wow. Can I get a copy?
They wanted to hear more about your line earlier about talking about erasure, about female abolitionists being erased from our historical memory of that movement, and thinking about some of these images that you've shown that are anti-slavery. Do we have evidence of women producing those images, and how does that make us read them, if so?
I have to say that everything I know about this is based on secondary material. So the book, although I had to use the abolitionist work to set up what I believe was responding to it, there are many other scholars who know much more about this than I do, except for, I will say, to the point that, of course, in similar ways to the ways that enslaved people and their histories and identities have been omitted or erased or covered up in the archival record and in the visual record and in the way history has been written. Of course, women's history, much of the same things could be said of women's history. There's a few really good sources I can send you to learn more. Maury McGinnis, Slaves Waiting for Sale, talks specifically about the origins of the abolitionist movement by English women and the ways that women in Boston and New York and other Northeastern locales organized and did this. Trying to think of the second source that's in my head. It's called a sisterhood of something, and if it comes to me, I'll bring it up. But part of my drive and part of what I felt keenly across the record is that, and I sort of open with this, is that this was not the history I was taught in my schooling. And the way, as we all know, history was written traditionally omits so much of the story. And so I was trying to dig out a part of the story that I felt it was really important to know about. And like I said, super relevant today.
Well, I thought, we were having a really wonderful conversation before we got started tonight about your tour through historic house museums. I thought, given the sponsorship of tonight's event by some of the local house museums that are trying to present a more inclusive narrative of the history of enslavement on those sites, the creation of these museums in the 20s, 30s, 40s, and onward are another way to create, I don't know, is that performance? Is that staging? Their art in of themselves, the houses themselves and the ways they're interpreted are also doing some of these similar things.
Oh yeah, I'm so inspired by the work of all the public historians out there and genealogists and others who are on the ground at those historic sites, whether it be in the archives, doing archaeology, thinking about family histories. I've attended virtually so many of the Coalition for Slavery in Louisville's events virtually. I'm just so inspired by the work that all of y'all are doing. I sort of forgot the second part of the question there, or where I was going with it, but I'm reliant on those public historians, on the Black genealogists, and on individual researchers to help me find the stories and piece together the people and help others. It's got to be a collective kind of effort because it is difficult work. It has been written out for so long, and finding these people is so critical, I think. So I really enjoy attending historic house museums, especially those that are engaged in that type of work. I always come away inspired. I learn so much. And you're exactly right. It's all part of the same story. And I don't know, they say it takes a village, and I really think it does.
Well, and we'll end. I would like to thank you. It's one of our great pleasures to see researchers and fellows come back around full circle and be able to share that work in this room with our members. This is the sort of the complete life cycle of everything we're trying to do at the Filson. Please, everybody, get a copy of the book, have it signed tonight. Thank you so much.
Thank you all.